Okay, welcome to the first lecture on Reconstruction, the United States post-Civil War. So, Reconstruction is the era between 1865 and 1877, wherein the United States is attempting to bring the Confederate States back into the Union and also attempting to establish the full and equal status as citizens of formerly enslaved African Americans. Now, the Civil War is a very devastating war. It ends April 9th, 1865, at the Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia, is where the final surrender terms are basically signed. The status of African Americans is kind of up in the air. They've been emancipated. They're no longer slaves, but they're also no longer citizens. They're not citizens either. Over 600,000 Americans died in this war, and the South is physically devastated by the war. And while slavery has been abolished, white supremacy does survive. This is the backdrop within which Reconstruction begins. Now, the Civil War settles the issue of the preeminence of the federal government, or theoretically it did. Again, these questions are raising their head again, even in contemporary times. It definitely expanded the power and the reach of the federal government and the executive office. But as I said, the status of African Americans being unclear created a lot of uncertainty. On January 1863, just to give this some context, President Lincoln issued an executive order basically freeing enslaved African people in those states that were in the rebellion, so only in the Confederate States. This excluded states like Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, and Delaware that had stayed in the Union, right? They still had their slaves. Now, this was a constitutionally and legally problematic uh, order. Lincoln very much wanted to amend the Constitution because that's really the only way that slavery could be ended, because, in fact, the Constitution did, you know, support the institution of slavery. But Lincoln is killed, April 14th, 1865, less than a week after the end of the war. He's actually assassinated, and Andrew Johnson becomes president. And this is the beginning of presidential reconstruction. Now, just to give you an idea of how stubborn white slave owners and other whites in the South were going to be about the issue of African Americans and equality, it took the U.S. Army, right, to literally deploy to the farther reaches of the Confederacy of Galveston, Texas, in order to force slave owners to acknowledge that slavery had ended. And this is where the holiday Juneteenth comes from. They have to keep in mind, Texas was founded almost specifically to preserve slavery and to enable it to expand westward, right? They had some of the most recalcitrant slave owners in the country. Even with the end of the war, they refused to release their enslaved people until General Gordon Granger was sent with the U.S. Army and read a proclamation, right? And this proclamation basically was a reiteration that, that you must relinquish your slaves. Slavery has ended. And this is the official end of slavery for a lot of areas in the South, but particularly in the South, right? Um, African American Texans began to commemorate this as a holiday, and now it's a federal holiday that kind of spread throughout the nation. This is the origin of this particular holiday, kind of the fact that you have a holiday that kind of reflects the extent to which slavers were determined to hold on to the status quo, really will help us answer a lot of questions as to their motivations and behaviors throughout Reconstruction. Reconstruction did have some pretty enormous achievements for African Americans. There are two periods to it: presidential Reconstruction and radical Reconstruction. But throughout Reconstruction, African Americans are plagued by white supremacist terrorism. There's some brief moments of African American autonomy, certainly a flourishing of African American political power with two senators and several congressmen and many state and municipal legislatures controlled by African Americans. Uh, Reconstruction generally is understood to end with the so-called 1877 Compromise, which we're going to discuss. But there were experiments even before Reconstruction really began in earnest, right, with the idea of African American autonomy and also with the idea of reparations. So Field Order number 15, issued January 16th, 1855, was kind of a form of reparations General William Tecumseh Sherman decided upon kind of on his own as a commanding general in these particular areas. These are basically the coasts of South Carolina and Georgia. Uh, General Sherman basically took 400,000 acres from slave owners who basically they'd abandoned the land, and redistributed the land amongst freed African Americans on the South Carolina and Georgia coasts. This decision originated from a discussion with local African American leadership, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, and of course General Sherman. They basically decided that these African Americans would be governed by themselves with no outside interference except for military protection, and basically that they were going to work the land, and this was really, he articulates this as kind of a compensation for the generations of their families who had been exploited. This is a brief flourishing of African American autonomy. Is going to end when President Johnson comes into office and basically turns the land back over to the former slave owners. But during this brief period, they established churches. They had a great emphasis on schools. They built schools. Um, they raised crops on the land, and their plan was to basically sell those crops on the global and local markets and be kind of self-sufficient. Again, this is all overturned by Johnson in the fall of 1865. But organized political power came from the churches, schools, and elected bodies amongst the freedmen. And there was an actual desire for autonomy amongst a lot of these people who really didn't necessarily want to become part of the American political society or American political family. So Andrew Johnson, as I said, becomes president after the assassination of President Lincoln. He was a former slave owner. He was very supportive of things like black codes because he wanted basically to return African Americans to kind of the same racial status quo that existed before slavery, only without slavery. It's in his period of presidential reconstruction that you really see a a flourishing and widespread white supremacist terrorism and acts of terror carried out against the African American population. So, being a Southern Democrat, President Johnson favored states' rights. He did not like the idea of the federal government intervening, especially when it came to issues of African American people and their protection. He pardoned probably hundreds of Confederates so that they could run for office and they wouldn't get prosecuted for criminal acts. And again, he kind of encourages the passing of these black codes, which are basically laws that were about keeping African Americans in close to a state of slavery as they could without actually enslaving them, which would have been unconstitutional now, right? And again, he's all about reestablishing the racial status quo, and he does everything he can to do that. So examples of black codes are like gun control. They would literally say the law would be African Americans cannot own weapons, cannot own guns. Crowd control. African Americans could not gather in groups of more than three or something without permission of the police chief. African Americans could not be witnesses in court against white people. Specifically, there were laws passed saying African Americans could not vote. One of the most insidious of the statutes that were passed were laws that said that African Americans had to be employed and have letters from their employers on them at all times, or they could be arrested and they could be put into forced labor for being vagrant. So here's an example of a black code from Opelousas, Alabama, basically talking about public meetings, and also talking about not being able to carry firearms or any types of weapons. So again, you got to keep in mind what these were about were, as I said, keeping African Americans kind of in a state as close to slavery as they possibly could, right? And this is going to be the impulse of white Southerners throughout Reconstruction and right up into the 20th century. As you get into, even the post-World War II period, there's still going to be kind of this impulse to keep African Americans at the bottom of the social, economic, cultural, and racial hierarchies. White supremacist terrorism, of course, begins immediately after the war. It becomes the primary method of keeping African Americans from exercising their rights, particularly 15th Amendment rights, which were passed in 1870. There were laws created to put African Americans back into a state nearing servitude. Laws and law enforcement become a tool of social control, as there's very few boundaries between groups like the Ku Klux Klan, formed in 1885, 1865 in Tennessee, and local police and local politicians who are actually often part of the Klan, as well as being politicians or police. There were other terrorist groups throughout the South being formed, Knights of the White Camellia, the Red Shirts, etc. But again, they're all about using terrorism in order to control the black population, keep them as a very cheap labor or even slave labor, and make sure that they did not achieve political power. These terrorist organizations were made up mostly of former soldiers. They engaged in murder, kidnappings, rapes, assassinations, arson, other types of property destruction, ethnic cleansing. They basically were used to terrorize, intimidate folks from running for office or voting, displaced and stole land. They operated secretly throughout Reconstruction, but they were forced further underground as Republicans are going to step in and establish an occupation of the South in order to stop it. They were in fact supported by Southern politicians, and they're going to be right up until the 1960s. When Congress went and did like a study of terrorist activity against African Americans, just over a 10-year period in just one part of northern Louisiana, this is what they found. They found 694 beatings and murders just in northern Louisiana alone in a 10-year period. So some examples of like violence when white supremacist terrorism slash mob violence is the New Orleans massacre on July 30th, 1866. You know, um, the thing with these terrorist groups, especially this isn't a case where they put masks on, but these were former soldiers in a lot of cases, basically being used by the white elites to reestablish the status quo. And also, again, for poor whites, a lot of them wanted to reestablish the racial privilege that they had, that they felt they were going to lose. This massacre carried out by whites in New Orleans was led by local police, the mayor, and what had happened was the U.S. Army had ended its occupation of New Orleans in May. Former Confederates began passing black codes. About 130 African American delegates and supporters gathered, right, and marched to the Mechanic Institute to meet and engage in political organizing to challenge the votes and to change laws, to challenge voting laws, and to basically be able to participate in the political process, right? Basically, the mayor gathers together the mob with the help of the police to stop them from meeting and basically murder 238 African American men. And this included 200 former soldiers. Many of them were murdered trying to surrender to the police. So this incident actually really infuriates um, white Northerners, particularly Republicans, as again, and they look at this as these Confederates behaving in this way after the loss of so many Union lives, right? And the loss of so many United States soldiers trying to establish not only the abolition of slavery, but kind of the safety and equality of African Americans, that they step in and basically this is what leads them to reoccupy the South, in fact. So So radical Reconstruction is going to start when the so-called radical Republicans take charge of Congress and the Senate. Basically, Frederick Douglass had pushed for the ballot and citizenship for African Americans, while many African Americans were kind of just satisfied with freedom. We saw in the case of the Sea Islands, right, with the Field Order 15, a lot of them didn't really want to assimilate into the political and the cultural and social system of white people. They kind of wanted to be off on their own. But Douglas kind of understood power, and he said he felt like the vote was necessary, right, in order to have the power to prevent those kind of massacres that we saw in New Orleans. So basically, in the March in the 1866 elections, basically what happens is the Republicans take the House and they take the Senate. They have a veto-proof majority, and basically from March of 1867 to the 1876 election, this is the period of radical Reconstruction. One of the things they're going to do immediately is pass the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which established freemen as citizens and protected the civil rights of freemen, meaning African Americans. Um, it also they were called radical, these Republicans, because they were determined that African Americans get the full rights of any other citizen and that they be kind of integrated into the national political family. They passed the Civil Rights Act over the veto of the president. As I said, they had a majority in both houses during the fall 1866 election. They had won that, and they put the South under military rule. They basically engaged in federal intervention. It was almost like a counterterrorism operation where they sent the army into the South in order to police these terrorist organizations. Some examples of radical Republicans would be Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts and Senator Thaddeus Stevens of Pennsylvania. At one point, they even attempted to impeach Johnson. I think they failed by one vote. So one of the things they passed was the Reconstruction Act. They passed it again right around the time it's the Civil Rights Act in March of 1867, which basically allowed for the partition of the South into military zones and occupied them with the military army, again with the army protecting the formerly enslaved population from terrorism of the white population. The 1868 election of Ulysses S. Grant put the executive branch and legislative branches all into the hands of the Republicans. And these enforcement acts protected African Americans' right to vote and specifically targeted white terrorist groups like the Klan that had since gone underground. In this period, you're going to end up with about 2,000 African Americans in public office. So we talked about the 13th Amendment, which ends slavery, but there's three amendments. It's really part of three amendments passed in this period we call the Reconstruction Amendments. Of course, you know about the 13th Amendment, prohibits slavery at the federal level except for if you're convicted of a crime. It's passed January of 1865. The 14th Amendment confers citizenship based upon birth. It nullified the three-fifths clause in the Constitution and provided for equal protection under the law, right? It also forbid former insurrectionists and rebels from occupying office. This is passed July 9th, 1868. The 15th Amendment passed March 30th, 1870, basically gives black men the right to vote. So all three of these amendments taken together basically enabled African Americans to move from the status of property or non-citizen, if one was not a slave, to the status of full citizens of the United States of America. One organization set up during Reconstruction was the Freedmen's Bureau. It was around for about 7 years. Basically, it was set up by the War Department. Its official name was the Bureau of Refugee, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands. It provided assistance to tens of thousands of former enslaved African Americans and impoverished whites in the southern states and the District of Columbia. It basically engaged in the social reconstruction of the community, giving out food and clothing, building schools, establishing hospitals and camps, and that sort of thing. They advocated not only for African Americans, but also for poor whites as well. established a number of colleges and training schools for African Americans, including Howard University, which is named for General O. Howard, as they promoted education. Um, they also performed marriages, negotiated employment and labor contracts between formerly enslaved blacks and plantation owners, and they investigated acts of racial violence. African Americans made up the overwhelming majority of Southern Republicans. They formed coalition with other poor whites and other Republicans during Reconstruction. As I said, some 2,000 African Americans held public office from the local level all the way up to U.S. Senate. Um, the many black leaders during Reconstruction had gained their freedom before the Civil War, right? So from the Senate, you had Hiram Rebels and Blanche K. Bruce from Mississippi. There were two black senators from Mississippi, 16 representatives in the House of Representatives, and about 600 state and local legislatures had significant black representation or black majorities. But in that period, in the 12-year period of Reconstruction, 35 African American politicians were murdered. So, white supremacist terrorism plagued Reconstruction throughout the period, but becomes extremely voracious and open and vicious as Reconstruction begins to wane. A particular incident on April 13th, 1873, in the county of Colfax in northern Louisiana, a massacre of approximately 150 African American men takes place. You know, you, Black citizens and Republicans had organized in militias and attempt to defend the Colfax County courthouse because what had happened was the municipal government, which had been voted in, was a black government, and a terrorist organization basically gathered together and they were going to attack the courthouse. So African American men came to defend the courthouse, but these whites came in, this terrorists came in, and they basically um, routed them and killed them, executed them, and basically took back control of the municipal government. So this was literally like a coup where they went in and they slaughtered the people who had been elected and who supported them, and they just installed their own government. This is going to establish a kind of pattern, as we're going to see. Becomes the norm as you get into the 1870s, as whites mobilize to, again, as they see it, they're retaking the South and they want to retake political power and then use that political power to disenfranchise and marginalize African Americans in every way possible, right? Um, this idea, this misrepresentation of African Americans as being unable to rule produces a myth that it was black misrule that led these whites to engage in these activities, that black people were ruling so poorly that whites felt desperate, so they formed these terrorist organizations in order to remove them. This becomes kind of how the history was told right up until probably the mid to late 1960s. The United States Supreme Court also, through the slaughterhouse cases, reinterpreted the 14th Amendment around the issue of equal protection under the law and limited this to national, not state government. So, in other words, what they said was that the federal government can protect the individual rights and provide equal protection, for example, multi-state corporations, but not individuals. When it came to the individual had to appeal actually to the state governments. This is going to be super problematic for formerly enslaved African Americans, for free blacks, because as these governments are being violently overthrown and taken over by whites, the whites who are in government are going to be the very terrorists who took their rights away from them and will continue to do so. So there's no one really to appeal to. So we get into our next discussion. We'll continue discussing the end of Reconstruction and what happens in the periods after it in terms of the status of African Americans.